The Cedar Creek Medical ICU smells like antiseptic and rain. Hannah Clarke arrives at 6:40 in the morning, parking her 10-year-old Subaru in the same space she's used for 4 years, and before she enters the building she reaches into her glove compartment and touches the folded flag. Her fingertips rest on it for exactly 3 seconds. The flag is made of heavy nylon, the fold sharp enough to cut, and it has been precisely creased since Baghdad. She doesn't look at it. She never looks at it. She just touches it and breathes and closes the glove compartment with her other hand. The parking lot is still dark. Streetlights cast everything in sodium orange. A few other nurses are arriving, the overnight shift heading toward exhaustion, the day shift preparing for 12 hours of code blues and morphine drips and the 1,000 small rituals of keeping people alive when their bodies want to stop. Hannah moves through them without speaking. She has perfected the art of presence without visibility, the way a good nurse moves through a hospital-like furniture rearranging itself, necessary but unobtrusive. Her badge reads H. Clarke, RN, ICU, with a photo taken 4 years ago when she was 34 and her face was still learning to hide things. She's 38 now and the face in that photo feels like someone else's. She clips the badge to her scrubs and enters through the north entrance where the automatic doors wheeze open like a ventilator coming to life. The morning air inside Cedar Creek is always the same temperature, 72 degrees, manufactured and still. The ICU occupies the entire 3rd floor. 24 beds, 23 currently occupied, each one monitoring the small failures and catastrophes of the human body. Hannah moves through the unit with the kind of fluid efficiency that comes from doing the same thing 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 4 years. Before that, she'd been somewhere else, somewhere where efficiency meant something different, where precision had different stakes, where the sounds of machines keeping people alive were interrupted by sounds of things trying to kill them. But that was a different life, and the rule she follows now is simple: nobody here needs to know about that. Her shift partner this morning is Curtis, a male nurse from Raleigh General who transferred to Cedar Creek 6 months ago. Curtis is 26 and excellent at his job, and he talks too much. Hannah respects all of these qualities in the measured way she respects things now, from a distance, with recognition but without engagement. "Morning, Hannah," Curtis says, already looking at the night shift report board. "We're getting Torres transferred in from trauma around 7. Shrapnel wounds, secondary infection risk, they're starting him on broad-spectrum antibiotics before the transfer. Room 317. Hannah doesn't react. She pulls up the admission note on the computer. Name, Corporal Michael Torres. Age, 29. Service history, United States Marine Corps, 2 deployments. Wounds, fragmentation injuries, left leg, left shoulder, thoracic wall. Current vital stable. Surgical repair completed at Duke. Now just observation, infection watch, recovery protocol. She's held his name in a compartment for 12 years. Corporal Torres. The medic who replaced her when she left Baghdad. The medic with the good hands, the ones who could work a tourniquet under fire without the tourniquet shaking. She'd trained him herself for 3 weeks before her medical evacuation order came through. She'd stood on the tarmac at Bagram and watched his face as she boarded the transport plane. He was 24 then, steady and young, and his hands were already good. She'd wondered if he would keep them good. She'd wondered if he would keep everything intact, all the pieces. She'd never wondered if their paths would cross again because she was very careful not to wonder about things that might break her composure. "You okay?" Curtis asks, because she's been staring at the screen without moving. "Fine," Hannah says. "Show me the chart." They review the notes for 15 minutes. Torres's case is straightforward: good surgical work at Duke, no active bleeding, infection markers within acceptable range but needing aggressive monitoring. His pain is controlled with fentanyl on a drip. They're observing for signs of compartment syndrome in the left leg, watching the thoracic wounds for secondary pneumothorax risk. Straightforward. Recoverable. The kind of case that feels manageable until it isn't. At 7:15, the transport team arrives with Torres on a stretcher. He's conscious and moving his eyes, tracking sound, the way patients do when they're medicated but not sedated. Hannah stands at the corner of room 317 and watches the transfer, smooth, professional, the transport team working in that careful way that comes from moving injured people long distances. They pivot his stretcher into position, disconnect the external monitors, and he's suddenly Cedar Creek's patient instead of Duke's. The nurses transfer him to the bed with practice synchronization, moving him on the count of 3, his breathing remaining steady throughout, his vital signs holding. And then he sees her. His eyes move across the room and find her standing in the corner near the window, her arms crossed, her face in the neutral expression she's learned to wear. His pupils dilate. His heart rate accelerates, she sees it on the monitor beside his bed. The monitor shows 84 beats per minute, then 91, then 98. His blood pressure rises equally. These are not the vital signs of a sedated patient whose pain is controlled. She doesn't meet his eyes. She looks at the 4 placement instead, good line, properly taped, no signs of infiltration. She makes a note of his current medication dosage. She checks his dressing. She does all of these things in the methodical way she's learned to do things, and she does not acknowledge that Corporal Michael Torres is staring at her as if a ghost has entered room 317 in the form of a woman in scrubs. Curtis is still in the room, charting something on the computer terminal. "You want to do the initial vitals check?" he asks Hannah. "Baseline measurements." "Yes," Hannah says. "Get his pain level." Curtis approaches the bed with a small tablet. "Corporal Torres, I'm Curtis. I'm going to be working with you during the day. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you say your pain is right now?" 3, Torres says. His voice is lower than she remembers. Deeper. But the cadence is the same, medical, controlled, giving information instead of emotion. Mostly the leg. Shoulders numb. That's the nerve block. It'll wear off in a few hours. We'll manage it. Curtis makes notes. Any nausea? Dizziness? No. Torres's eyes haven't moved from the corner where Hannah is standing. Hannah turns away and walks to the monitors. She checks the heart rate, the blood pressure, the oxygen saturation. Everything is within acceptable parameters except for the tachycardia and hypertension, which are entirely unacceptable and entirely her fault because she is standing in his room. She makes a decision. She leaves. "I'll be doing the noon rounds," she tells Curtis. "Page me if anything changes with him." In the hallway, she walks past the nursing station and into the supply room. She doesn't go there to get supplies. She goes there because the supply room has no windows and only one door, and she can close that door and be alone with the knowledge that Corporal Michael Torres is now a room in her hospital, a patient she will see during every shift she works, a person whose chest is rising and falling in the cadence of sedation 3 doors down from where she's standing. The supply room smells like plastic and cardboard and the faint chemical tang of sterilization. Hannah stands there for 42 seconds, she counts them. In those 42 seconds she reminds herself of the protocol: a patient is a patient. A medic from Baghdad is just another patient. The fact that she trained him means nothing. The fact that she left him there and he stayed and took shrapnel in places where shrapnel shouldn't go means nothing. The fact that his heart rate elevated when he saw her means nothing. None of it means anything because that was a different life and this is this life, and the only way to survive this life is to never acknowledge that they are connected. She leaves the supply room at 7:48 and moves through the ICU with renewed attention to detail. She checks on 3 other patients. She confirms medication orders. She changes an 4 bag on a post-op cardiac patient. She works with the kind of precision that comes from 12 years of practice and 4 years of deliberately not thinking about anything that happened before Cedar Creek Medical existed. At 8 o'clock, Dr. Ashford arrives for morning rounds. He's 62 years old and he wears suits instead of white coats, which Hannah has always found to be a choice that communicates something about the difference between being a doctor and being a healer. His face is the color of sun-damaged leather. His teeth are very white and very straight, the kind of teeth that come from dentists in Charleston or Savannah, the kind of teeth that announce money. He carries a tablet and a thermos of coffee and the manner of a man who has never once doubted his own authority. "Morning, everyone," he announces to the nursing staff clustered near the medication station. Let's begin in room 305. I want to discuss the respiratory status update before we move through the rest of the unit. Hannah moves with the rest of the staff. Morning rounds follow a specific protocol. The doctor approaches a room, reviews the chart, examines the patient, and makes decisions about treatment modifications. It's a choreography that Hannah has performed hundreds of times. She stands beside the chart. She provides vital sign information. She answers questions about medication responses and dressing conditions. She makes herself useful but unobtrusive. Room 305 is an elderly woman with pneumonia. Room 308 is a man recovering from emergency bypass surgery. Room 312 is a patient with severe burn wounds waiting for transfer to a specialized unit. They move through the unit like a small procession. Hannah stays in the background, present but not intrusive, the way a good ICU nurse moves through rounds. When they reach room 317, something in the air pressure changes. Dr. Ashford pauses at the threshold. He looks at Torres's chart. He looks at Torres in the bed. And then he glances back toward where Hannah is standing, fifth person back in the line, visible but not prominent, her face in the neutral expression she's maintained all morning. Ashford's eyes travel from Hannah to Torres and back again. Something in his expression shifts, a small recalibration of calculation. He enters the room and performs the examination, checking the dressings, reviewing the surgical notes, asking Torres standard questions about pain level and nausea. Torres answers everything correctly and calmly. His vital signs have returned to baseline. He's a model patient. But his eyes track toward Hannah twice during the examination, and Ashford sees both instances. After the examination is complete, Ashford turns to face the gathering of nurses and residents. Corporal Torres here is a combat veteran, Ashford announces, as if this is a piece of information the gathered staff needs to understand. Marine Corps medic. 2 deployments. Interesting case in terms of psychological resilience. He pauses. Some people are simply built differently. Some people handle trauma more effectively. He turns back to Hannah, still standing at the edge of the group. What do you think, Miss Clarke? In your experience, are some people simply more equipped to handle difficult situations? Hannah doesn't react. Her face remains in the neutral expression. She says, I think recovery depends on individual circumstances and medical support, Dr. Ashford. A diplomatic answer, Ashford says, and he smiles in a way that isn't a smile. But I wonder if you have more personal thoughts on the subject. No, sir, Hannah says. Diplomatic is professional. Ashford holds her gaze for 3 seconds longer than necessary. She can see the recalculation happening behind his eyes, a shift in his assessment of her. He has decided something. It's small, a moment of recognition that she is not quite what she appears to be, and it's the moment when everything begins to change, though neither of them knows it yet. Right, Ashford says. Moving on. Room 318. The procession continues down the corridor. Hannah returns to the medication station and checks 3 drips for proper flow rate. Her hands are completely steady. Her breathing is completely steady. This is what she does now. This is what she's good at. She holds things together with hands that trained in a desert in a different lifetime, and she does it with the kind of composure that comes from having already learned that breaking apart is not an option. At 9:30, during the shift's first quiet moment, Curtis approaches her near the computer terminal. So that Torres kid seems to know you, he says. It's not a question. I've probably worked with him before, Hannah says without looking up from the screen. Small world. Yeah, maybe, Curtis says. But he was asking about you specifically. Like, he asked if you were the same person, if you'd worked somewhere else before this. Hannah's hands remain on the keyboard, but she stops typing. What did you tell him? I said I didn't know, Curtis says. But I figured I'd ask you. Did you work with him somewhere? A while ago, Hannah says. Before Cedar Creek. Before Raleigh, actually. That's nice, Curtis says, and he means it. He's young enough to think these coincidences are nice things. Small world reuniting people like that. Yes, Hannah says. Small world. But it's not a small world. It's a world with specific weights and specific measures, and certain people are supposed to stay in certain places, and when they cross paths it's not because the world is small, it's because the world has decided to test you, to see if you're still holding together properly, to see if 4 years of careful compartmentalization can survive the presence of a medic named Torres in room 317, asking about a nurse he used to know in Baghdad. Hannah finishes her shift at 6:38 in the evening. She hands her notes off to the night nurse. She clocks out at the station. She walks to her car in the parking lot, and before she drives away, she reaches into the glove compartment and touches the folded flag again, 3 seconds, the same as she always does, except this time her touch lingers for a 4th second, a 5th second, before she forces her hand to release it and close the compartment. The Grand Rounds Lecture Hall at Cedar Creek Medical held 23 residents in pressed white coats, their notepads open, their eyes fixed on Dr. Ashford as he stood before the projection screen with Hannah's patient chart enlarged across it. Torres's name was redacted, but his vitals were there, oxygen saturation trending downward, respiratory rate climbing, the subtle indicators that meant something was wrong. Ashford tapped the chart with his pen, his voice smooth as polished stone. "This," he said, "is how not to document a treatment plan." The residents shifted. Someone coughed. "Our friend here seems to think clinical protocol is optional. Observe the lack of specificity. Observe the absence of physician consultation before nursing assessment." He turned to face the room. This is what happens when discipline fails. When someone prioritizes intuition over procedure. He didn't say Hannah's name. He didn't have to. Every resident in the room knew exactly which nurse had written those notes. Hannah stood against the far wall, her arms crossed loosely, her breathing unchanged. 1 measured breath in. 1 measured breath out. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical song, indifferent to the weight pressing down on her chest. She had survived worse than public humiliation. She had survived Fallujah. She had survived watching her teammate bleed out in her arms while sand whipped across the FOB and rounds snapped overhead. She could survive this. What she couldn't survive was the knowledge that Torres was in room 317, 2 floors below this lecture hall, and his oxygen saturation was dropping by fractions every hour, and the man mocking her charting was the one doctor who could authorize the interventions Torres might need. The lecture ended 15 minutes later. Residents filed out, some casting sideways glances at Hannah as they passed. She turned to leave, moving toward the stairwell with the same measured pace she used when walking through a hallway full of IEDs, present, alert, betraying nothing. Her hands, steady as surgical lasers, hung at her sides. The break room was empty except for the vending machine humming its low electrical song and the coffee maker gurgling its final drops. Hannah inserted 3/4 into the machine and pressed B7. A bag of pretzels dropped with a mechanical thud. She was reaching for the slot when the door swung open and Dr. Ashford entered with 2 colleagues, Dr. Pierce from cardiology and Dr. Bennett from internal medicine. Both men had the look of politicians dressed in scrubs, the kind of doctors who spent more time at donor events than bedside. Ashford saw Hannah and his smile sharpened like a blade-catching light. "Ah, Nurse Clarke," he said, his voice pitched loud enough to carry. "Just reviewing your documentation from this morning. Perhaps military discipline doesn't translate to reading comprehension." He glanced at his colleagues, who offered uncomfortable chuckles. Or maybe they just don't teach critical thinking in boot camp. The break room felt smaller. The fluorescent light seemed brighter. Hannah's jaw tightened, a single muscle movement, barely visible, the kind of physical restraint that cost everything. She turned to face him, and her eyes met his with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The kind of calm that terrifies people who rely on breaking others down. 1 tear escaped down her cheek. Not from sadness. Not from shame. From the sheer force of holding herself together while every cell in her body, cells that had been forged in combat, that had memorized the smell of cordite and spent brass and blood on hot asphalt, screamed to respond. She wiped the tear without breaking eye contact. Perhaps leadership doesn't translate to cruelty, Doctor. The break room went silent. The vending machine hummed. The coffee maker dripped. Dr. Pierce and Dr. Bennett exchanged glances, the kind men exchange when they suddenly realize they might be standing next to someone far more dangerous than they assumed. Ashford's face flushed from chin to hairline. His hand came up, pointing toward the door where a security guard stood near the administrative office, a man whose presence had not been accidental. "That's insubordination," Ashford said, his voice dropping to a register that was somehow more threatening than his previous performance. "I can have security escort you out right now. One more word, Sergeant, and you're done." Hannah said nothing. She looked at him for one more second, long enough for him to understand that she had heard him, registered him, and decided he wasn't worth her breath. Then she turned, picked up her fallen pretzels from where they had scattered on the linoleum floor, and walked past all three men toward the door. The security guard stepped aside. Her badge clattered softly against her ribs as she moved, the small gold nameplate catching fluorescent light. The afternoon rounds were worse than the morning had been. Ashford pulled her into his office at 2:30, his door closed, his voice dropping into the register he reserved for maximum damage. "You think you're special because you wore a uniform," he said. "You're just another nurse who can't follow orders. You're Sergeant Failure, and everyone on this floor knows it." He said the nickname loud enough for the nursing station outside his office to hear clearly. Three nurses averted their eyes as Hannah emerged 10 minutes later. One of them, Emaya, who had worked ICU nights with Hannah for 4 years, suddenly found something urgent in the supply closet. By sunset, Ashford's strategic campaign had already begun in earnest. Hannah discovered that her two closest colleagues, Maria and Jess, had been reassigned to different floors effective immediately. The shift schedule had been altered so that Hannah worked alone on nights, no backup, no peer support, no witnesses to anything that might happen. Her access to the patient database was suddenly restricted, requiring Dr. Ashford's personal approval for any chart updates. She had to request his authorization to document vital signs. When she requested access to Torres's updated labs, the response came back flagged, inappropriate frequency of access noted. Physician approval required before next query. The memo about scope of practice violations hit the board that evening, unsigned but clearly directed at her. It outlined 7 theoretical violations, all vague, all technically defensible, all designed to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of administrators and board members. Within 2 hours, Hannah overheard Dr. Ashford on the phone in his office, his voice carefully modulated. "I'm simply concerned about pattern behavior and professional judgment. No, nothing specific yet. Just monitoring." Torres was waiting when she made her evening rounds. His eyes tracked her as she checked his vitals, oxygen saturation 91% and dropping, respiratory rate 26, the kind of numbers that meant his collapsed lung was progressing, that his body was working harder with every breath to push oxygen into his blood. He whispered as she adjusted his full line, "Gunny." She shook her head slightly, barely a millimeter of movement, and he understood. The recognition in his eyes, the knowledge that his former commanding officer was standing here in scrubs, in this hospital, tending to him, would only make things worse if Ashford found out. She squeezed his arm once and moved to the next room, her heart rate elevated but her face neutral, her hand steady as she documented his vitals in the system while secretly knowing that Ashford would scrutinize every number, looking for errors. In the supply room during her break, Hannah sat on the metal folding chair in the dark, her hand reaching into her pocket where she kept the folded flag from her teammate, the one who had taken shrapnel in her place 12 years ago, the one she had held while his blood soaked into her uniform and the rotor wash of the medevac Black Hawk shook the earth around them. Her fingers traced the creases in the fabric, the weight of it heavy as a funeral gun salute. What happened next didn't just change everything. It made it all inevitable. The monitor screamed at 2 a.m. Not the soft persistent beep of normal operations. Not the rhythmic pulse of a steady heartbeat translated to sound. This was the alarm, the code blue alarm, the "we're losing him" alarm, the room temperature dropping kind of scream that cuts through sleep and muscle memory alike. Hannah's eyes snapped open before her feet hit the floor. She'd been sitting in the break room chair, head tilted back against the wall, running on the fumes of coffee and discipline. 12 years of Baghdad taught her to sleep with her nervous system wound tight as a spring. One sound and she was already moving. Room 317. Torres. She was through the ICU doors in 8 seconds. The hallway fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical monotone, indifferent to the emergency unfolding behind the glass partition. Her shoes, regulation hospital slip ONS, quiet on tile, carried her down the corridor with the same precision she'd once used moving through Cedar City. The moment she entered the room, the math became automatic. Trachea deviated hard to the right. Chest asymmetric, left side compressed, barely moving. Oxygen saturation dropping in real time on the monitor, 88. 84, 79. Lips already taking on that blue tint. Torres's eyes rolling back. Pupils dilating. The ventilator was pushing air into dead space while his lung collapsed like a fist closing. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, compressing the lung, collapsing the mediastinum, cutting off venous return to the heart. Classic presentation. Textbook death if untreated in the next 90 seconds. The code team was 3 minutes out. Hannah moved to the crash cart without hesitation. Her hands knew the choreography. 14-gauge angiocath needle, 14 millimeters of steel that could bridge the gap between life and catastrophic failure. The intercom crackled somewhere distant, code blue, ICU, room 317, but the announcement was already obsolete. She was already here. She was already moving. The needle went into her hand like a familiar weapon. Step away from that patient, Clarke. Ashford stood in the doorway, wearing scrubs and rage in equal measure. The on-call room had been his sanctum, his place to rest between shifts of clinical superiority. He'd been pulled from sleep by the same alarm that woke Hannah, except his body moved with the sluggish resentment of a man unused to emergency. His hair was disheveled. His voice carried that particular venom that came from being interrupted. Hannah didn't look at him. She positioned Torres's left arm across his chest, exposing the space between the ribs. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomy was as fixed as the rising sun. Wait for the attending. Ashford's voice dropped lower, colder. That is not your scope of practice. I am ordering you to step back. Torres gasped, a sound like something drowning in air. His fingers clawed at the bed rail. The monitor showed what was happening before any words could explain it. The oxygen was leaving his blood. The heart rate climbing. The blood pressure collapsing. 78 systolic. 72. The body shutting down. Hannah looked at Ashford. Just for a moment. Just long enough for him to see exactly what she saw. He'll be dead in 90 seconds, she said. The words came out measured, flat, carrying the weight of certainty. Not a question. Not a request for permission. A statement of physics and time and the mathematics of collapse. Ashford's face flushed. His hand moved toward his phone, toward the security office, toward the machinery of his institutional power. If you do that, you're fired. The needle entered the space between Torres's ribs with the kind of precision that comes from hands that have been taught to keep people breathing through artillery and ambush and the collapse of everything orderly. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were as reliable as the stars. The needle broke through the pleura. The hiss of air escaping filled the room like a punctured tire finally releasing pressure, except this pressure had been compressing a man's heart and collapsing his lung and stealing his oxygen. The hiss meant survival. The hiss meant she'd done it correctly. The hiss meant Torres lived for another minute, and then another. His body convulsed once, a reflex, not a seizure, and then the blue started leaving his lips. The oxygen saturation climbed, 79. 84 and 91. His eyes stopped rolling. His breathing synchronized with the ventilator instead of fighting it. The heart rate came down from 142 to 118. The blood pressure stabilized, 104/67. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Alive. The code team burst through the door 40 seconds later, already moving in formation, expecting to find a patient in collapse. Instead they found Hannah standing beside a stabilized patient, her hand still holding the needle she'd used to decompress his chest, her eyes fixed on the monitor where the numbers confirmed everything she'd already known. The attending, Dr. Patricia Chen, a woman who'd seen enough trauma to recognize competence when it walked into a room, took in the scene in a single glance. Her eyes moved from Torres to Hannah to Ashford standing pale in the doorway, and something shifted in her expression. Not surprise. Recognition. Needle decompression? Chen asked, already reaching for the chest tube tray. Her voice carried the quick-fire efficiency of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions under pressure for longer than politics had a voice. 14 gauge, Hannah said. Left second intercostal, midclavicular line. Released immediately upon penetration of the pleura. Chen nodded once, sharp, authoritative. She was already assessing Torres, checking the breath sounds on the left that suddenly existed again, verifying the trachea had shifted back to midline, confirming that whatever Hannah had done, she'd done it right. Without this intervention, Chen said quietly, not looking at anyone specific, this patient would have arrested before we made it through the ICU doors. She glanced at Hannah. Just a moment. Just long enough. Good work. Ashford's face had gone from red to white to a shade of grey that matched the institutional walls. His hand was still halfway toward his phone. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water, searching for oxygen in an environment that no longer supplied it. Hannah released the needle to Chen's hands and stepped back from the bed. Her pulse was steady. Her hands weren't shaking. The adrenaline that should have made her tremble had been replaced by something older and colder, the particular calm that comes from having already survived worse, from knowing that your training was sharper than anyone's fear. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the moment when every nurse on the night shift, every single person who'd heard the code blue announcement, who'd been reassigned by Ashford's scheduling manipulations, who'd seen their patient files restricted and their observations dismissed, the moment when every one of them was standing in the hallway outside room 317, watching the monitors, watching Hannah, watching the moment when their fear transformed into something else entirely. Ashford was still standing in the doorway. Still watching. Still understanding, with the kind of terrible clarity that only comes too late, that he'd just witnessed something he couldn't undo, couldn't reframe, couldn't spin into a policy violation or a scope of practice issue or a reason to call security. He'd just watched Hannah Clarke save a man's life with the kind of precision that military training leaves in your muscle memory, and every person on that night shift had witnessed it. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song. The ventilator wheezed its steady rhythm. The monitor displayed a heartbeat that should have stopped 3 minutes ago but didn't because a quiet nurse knew exactly where to put a needle and exactly when to push it through. Hannah turned and walked back toward the door, passing Ashford without looking at him. She moved like someone who'd seen worse, done harder, carried more weight than any title or credential could measure. Her scrubs were still clean. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke to the night shift nurse outside the door, was quiet but audible in that suddenly silent corridor. He'll need continuous monitoring for pneumothorax recurrence, she said. Check breath sounds every 30 minutes. Note any decline in oxygen saturation. The nurse, Rodriguez, a young man who'd been assigned elsewhere by Ashford's latest schedule manipulation, nodded without speaking. His eyes tracked from Hannah to Ashford, and the understanding passed between them like electricity through water. The on-call room waited empty down the hallway. The break room chair was still warm from where Hannah had been sitting. The vending machine hummed its mindless song. But everything had changed in the time it took to deploy a needle and release the pressure that had been killing Corporal Mike Torres, killing him slowly while institutional hierarchy decided whether a nurse had the right to save him. The morning light filtered through the hospital windows like filtered plasma, sterile, purposeful, unforgiving. Dr. Ashford had not slept. The attending's report sat on his desk at 6:30 a.m., typed and witnessed an absolute. The needle decompression had saved Corporal Torres's life. Medically indefensible to argue otherwise. The muscles in Ashford's jaw worked silently as he read the clinical summary again. Dr. Chen's signature was there. Unmistakable. The nurses who witnessed the procedure had documented it. Everything pointed to a single, catastrophic truth: the bedside nurse had performed an invasive intervention outside her scope, violated chain of command, and prevented a death. Which meant Ashford's only option was to erase the witnesses and weaponize the violation. He reached for his phone at 6:45 a.m. The first call went to board member Patricia Hendricks, a retired administrator with 3 decades of hospital politics wired into her nervous system. "Patricia, it's David." His voice carried the texture of genuine concern, the sound of a man bearing bad news reluctantly. "I have a patient safety incident that needs addressing. A nurse performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. It's protocol, you understand. These things have to be managed carefully, but they have to be managed." Patricia listened. Patricia always listened. Patricia then made a call to the chief nursing officer. By 7 a.m., the narrative had shifted. By 7:15, it was already distributed: unsafe practice, scope violation, physician override of direct orders. The second call went to Dr. Marcus Webb in the surgical wing, no relation to the Special Forces colonel who would arrive 3 days later. "I need a favor," Ashford said. "The ICU nurse who scrubbed into Torres's emergency. Excellent clinical eye, but she's become a liability in terms of institutional liability. I'm going to need her isolated from witnesses. Can you use her on the orthopedic floor? 3rd shift, starting this week." Marcus, who owed Ashford a recommendation letter for his upcoming promotion, agreed without hesitation. The reassignment was processed by 8 a.m. By 8:30, Ashford had called hospital security and requested a schedule modification. The 2 nurses who had watched Hannah perform the needle decompression, Jennifer Robles and Michael Chen's wife, Susan, found themselves transferred within 60 minutes. Robles to pediatrics on the night shift. Susan to post-op recovery on the opposite end of the hospital's north wing. The timing was precise. Professional. Completely within administrative discretion. No one could argue it was retaliation because no one could prove intent. Ashford was simply optimizing floor coverage. Simply managing resources. Simply ensuring that no 2 witnesses to the same event remained in the same clinical space. He spent the next 2 hours on his computer, typing amendments to hospital protocol documents. He flagged Hannah's patient charts from the past 3 months, highlighting sections where her clinical notes might be interpreted as overstepping: a recommendation to increase sedation without explicit physician approval, a notation about patient vitals that she had written in anticipatory language. The words were correct. The documentation was sound. But in the hands of a liability attorney, they became evidence of a nurse who believed she could make independent medical decisions. By noon, he had drafted her termination letter. 3 paragraphs. 2 violations. Termination effective immediately. He read it once, twice, 3 times, refining the language until it was unassailable. Then he called Hannah's extension. "My office." 20 minutes. Hannah was in the break room when the call came through. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge above her head. She was holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she'd sat motionless, thinking about Torres's oxygen saturation climbing. 88, 92, 96, the way his color had changed. The way his breathing had eased the moment the pressure released. The hiss of air and then the relief. She had not slept. She had come back to the hospital at 6 a.m. anyway, because that's what you did. You showed up. You worked. You held the line between life and the other thing. The call interrupted nothing. She set the cup down. The rim left a ring on the Formica counter. Ashford's office was on the 3rd floor, wood paneling and degrees from expensive universities mounted on walls painted a color that looked like compromise. His desk was an island of dark mahogany in a sea of corporate beige. Hannah had only been inside his office twice before, both times for mandatory annual reviews. Today, security stood outside the door. She noticed them the way a soldier notices a weapon in an unfamiliar hand, not with alarm, but with information processing. "Sit," Ashford said. Hannah sat. The chair was too low. By design, she realized. Everything about this room was designed to position him higher, larger, more authoritative. "You performed an invasive procedure yesterday," he began. His voice was steady. Clinical. The voice of a man reading a pathology report. A needle decompression. Without physician authorization. Without consulting the attending. "The patient was dying," Hannah said. "That is not relevant." "It absolutely is. You violated direct orders." Ashford slid a document across his desk. The termination letter. Her name at the top. Precise bullet points listing violations. 3 paragraphs that would follow her through every future employment inquiry. "This constitutes grounds for immediate termination. Your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated effective now. You have 30 minutes to clear your locker and vacate the premises. Security will escort you from the building." Hannah looked at the letter. The paper was expensive. The letterhead was embossed. Every word was chosen specifically to be unchallengeable. She had read enough legal documents to understand that this was not a negotiation. This was the closing of a door. The sound it made was not loud. It was the quiet hiss of a lock engaging. "Corporal Torres is stable," she said quietly. Corporal Torres's outcome does not change institutional policy. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not defend herself, because there was nothing to defend against. The violation was real. The procedure had been necessary. Both things were true and both things were irrelevant. She stood. The security officers were waiting outside the door, polite and professional and absolutely immovable. She walked past them toward the elevator. The ICU was already in morning shift changeover. The machines hummed their mechanical rhythm. The monitors beeped their 3-beat patterns like the pulse of something vast and unknowable. Torres was sedated and breathing steadily, his chest rising and falling with the even rhythm of a man whose lungs were no longer compromised. The new nurse, one of the transfers, because Ashford had thought even farther ahead than anyone realized, was checking his lines. Hannah touched his chart once. Just once. Her hand lingered for a second on the plastic spine, and then she let go. She walked downstairs. 30 minutes. The clock was already running. Her locker was in the break room. She had been working at Cedar Creek for 4 years. Her possessions took 7 minutes to box. A photograph of a hiking trail in North Carolina that her brother had texted her. A spare pair of compression socks. A half-empty container of peppermint lozenges. A name badge that had been scanned into the building's security system thousands of times. And in her jacket pocket, the thing she had carried since Baghdad. The folded flag. She had never put it in her locker. Never left it unattended. It stayed on her person always, like a heartbeat that lived outside her chest. The parking garage was cool and smelled like concrete and diesel exhaust and the faint chemical edge of brake fluid. Her car was a 10-year-old Honda Civic, nothing remarkable, nothing memorable. She unlocked it and sat behind the wheel. The leather seat was cold even though the day outside was warming toward noon. She did not start the engine. She rested her head on the steering wheel instead, hands gripping the edges, and sat there while the seconds accumulated into minutes. 10 minutes. 15. She had been shot twice. Once in the shoulder and once high on her left thigh. She had treated wounds in the field with nothing but a combat lifesaver kit and the kind of composure that comes from understanding that panic is a luxury. She had held men's hands while they died. She had performed emergency procedures with incoming fire echoing off concrete walls. She had not cried since Baghdad. She did not cry now, but her hands trembled. Not from fear. From something else. Restraint. The accumulated weight of becoming invisible. Of being so careful to fold yourself into the institutional margins that no one could touch you, and having discovered that the margins were where predators hunted. She reached down and opened the glove compartment. The folded flag lay there, precisely folded into a triangle, the stars buried underneath, the red stripes visible like the only thing left of something that had mattered. It was from James Hartley's uniform. She had carried it since 2012, since the morning they had loaded his body into the transport with the ceremony of men who had learned that ritual was sometimes the only thing that stood between you and the void. The flag had outlasted her career. Her rank. Her identity. Soon it would outlast her presence in Raleigh, in this parking garage, in this particular chapter of her life where she had tried to be someone else. Someone safer. Someone smaller. Someone who could fit into the shape that institutions required. 23 minutes had passed. She closed the glove compartment. Started the engine. The radio came on, a news broadcast about interest rates and hospital funding. She turned it off. The silence was absolute. The kind of silence that comes before something breaks. She put the car in park and waited, her hands on the steering wheel, watching the garage entrance where nothing was happening yet. Watched the concrete pillars and the empty parking spaces and the security cameras mounted in corners like waiting eyes. 3 days away. She did not know that yet. But the wheels had already started turning. The phone calls were already being made. The orders were already being transmitted through channels that did not require paperwork or institutional approval. By the time the sun rose on the fourth morning after Torres's emergency, every single person in the command structure that had once been hers would know what Ashford had done. And they would respond in the only language they understood. She sat in the car. She waited. She did not move. 3 days. 72 hours of waiting in her apartment with the folded flag on her kitchen table, the fabric worn soft from years of carrying it, from holding it through ceremonies she never attended. Hannah had not slept. She had not turned on the television. She had simply sat in the dark with a cup of cold coffee and watched the flag as if it might speak, as if it might tell her what came next. The folded triangle sat beneath her window where afternoon light cut through the blinds in precise geometric lines, and she thought about Corporal Mike Torres recovering in Cedar Creek's ICU, thought about Dr. Ashford walking those same corridors believing he had won, believing the silence meant his version of the truth had held. She thought about the $847,000 severance package they would never offer her, the lawsuit her lawyer had already begun drafting, the permanent notation in her personnel file that would follow her to every hospital system in North Carolina. Then, at 11:47 a.m., the windows began to vibrate. The sound was not distant. It was immediate and intimate, a rhythm that bypassed her ears and moved through her bones like sonar through water. Hannah stood without thinking, her hands steady as they had been steady holding Torres's chest open in darkness, as they had been steady for every critical moment of her life. The rotor wash shook the apartment complex hard enough that her neighbor's car alarm triggered, a thin wailing beneath the deeper mechanical thunder of the aircraft. She moved to the window. The Black Hawk descended toward Cedar Creek Medical's west parking lot like a predator settling into feeding grounds, its nose tilted forward, its massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed half the parking lot at once. Behind it came the convoy, 2 humps, each one painted in desert tan and bearing the angular precision of military geometry, and then a third vehicle, this one black, containing the weight of institutions that did not announce themselves. Hannah's breathing did not change. Her pulse did not accelerate. The trembling was not fear. It was recognition. It was the moment she had buried so deep that part of her had believed it was gone forever. She dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray button-down, her only pair of shoes without a military crease. She left the folded flag on the kitchen table. She locked her apartment and drove to Cedar Creek in complete silence, radio off, windows down, the November air sharp enough to taste like copper. The parking lot had transformed into a military installation. Traffic had been rerouted. Security personnel in dress uniforms stood at the entrances. A colonel in full dress blue stood in the hospital lobby with his hands at parade rest, his decorations arranged on his chest like a map of every conflict of the last 2 decades. When he saw Hannah step through the automatic doors, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Gunnery Sergeant Clarke," he said. Not a question. Not a greeting. A confirmation. A voice like a tank idling in a garage, authoritative and dangerous in its absolute steadiness. "Sir." She did not salute. Protocol in civilian space allowed it, but he had not required it. She gave what she was asked for and nothing more. The colonel gestured toward the ICU corridor, and Hannah walked. They did not speak. Boots on tile, 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of authority moving through the hospital like a knife through soft tissue, and then into the atrium where the glass ceiling let in the afternoon light like a benediction. There, standing beside the fountain where Torres had been admitted 71 hours earlier, was a man Hannah had not seen in 12 years. Captain Daniel Reeves. Torres's older brother. The boy who had watched Hannah deploy from a military base in North Carolina when Danny was 16 years old, who had written letters that Torres smuggled home under his cot, who had grown into a military officer holding a folder that bore the red stamp of classified material. When he saw Hannah, his eyes filled with tears that did not spill over but simply sat there, waiting, holding their weight. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said, and his voice broke on her rank like it was the hardest word he had ever spoken. They did not embrace. They stood with the distance between them that protocol and professionalism required, and that was the correct thing to do. Hannah held his gaze. "How is he?" she asked. "Stable. Improving. Asking for you." Danny opened the folder with hands that shook slightly. Inside were photographs from Baghdad, from Sanjin Valley, from Jolan District, from every place where the line between alive and dead had been drawn in sand and blood. Inside were the medical reports, official and redacted, that documented what everyone already knew, that Hannah Clarke had saved lives she had been ordered to let die, had made decisions in the space of seconds that no individual should ever be forced to make alone. "You never told anyone," Danny said. "You never told us." Before Hannah could respond, a voice cut across the atrium like a rifle crack. A SEAL team leader, Master Chief Garrett Holloway, emerged from the ICU corridor in civilian dress but carrying the unmistakable weight of a man who had killed and would kill again without hesitation. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and precise. "Bronze Star with Valor," he said. The words hung in the air like a benediction. Hannah's vision did not blur. Her hands did not clench. Her breathing remained even and controlled. "Purple Heart, sustained September 14, 2009, he continued, each word a sentence. "Combat Action Ribbon, first award. Combat Action Ribbon, second award." He paused. He was not reading from a document. He was reciting what he had memorized, what his unit had made him memorize before this moment. And a Navy Cross. Classified citation. "Unsealed today." Dr. Ashford emerged from his office as Holloway spoke the last words. The color drained from his face with such complete and sudden intensity that Hannah thought for a moment he might lose consciousness right there in the corridor. She watched him process the reality of what was standing in his hospital, what uniform was being worn, what the military presence represented. His mouth opened. His hands trembled in his pockets. He tried to speak and nothing emerged but a small, strangled sound. The moment lasted exactly 5 seconds. Then he retreated to his office and locked the door. An FBI agent named Morrison stepped forward from beside the colonel, her badge catching the light in sharp geometric angles. "Gunnery Sergeant Clarke, you are being recalled for a classified medical advisory mission to a forward operating base in Central Asia," she said. It was not a question. "Your service is required effective immediately. You will brief at Raleigh-Durham International Airport at 1800 hours. Your transportation and all necessary documentation will be provided." She extended an envelope containing orders signed by someone whose name Hannah recognized from intelligence briefings, from operations she had sworn never to discuss. Hannah took the envelope. Her hands were steady. The trembling was restraint. But that wasn't the worst part. As Hannah turned toward the ICU to see Torres, a man in a Marine Corps IT specialist uniform approached Morrison. His name was Rodriguez. His hands held a USB drive the size of a thumb, and his jaw was set with the quiet fury of someone who had decided that corruption required bearing witness. "Agent Morrison," he said, "I need to show you something." They moved to a hospital terminal, and Rodriguez pulled up security footage from the night of Hannah's firing. The timestamp read 3:14 a.m. Dr. Ashford sat at his desk, his face illuminated by the glow of the hospital database, his fingers moving with deliberate precision across the keyboard. He was scrolling through the records of Corporal Torres's emergency. He was highlighting the timestamp for the needle decompression. He was deleting Hannah's documentation of the procedure. He was attempting to erase the evidence that she had saved a life. Rodriguez had backed up every frame, every keystroke, every moment of attempted obstruction. He had known something was wrong. He had known a good nurse didn't get fired for saving a patient's life unless someone powerful wanted to bury that fact in darkness. The hospital CEO arrived within 20 minutes. She watched the footage. She said nothing. Within 2 hours, Dr. Ashford was escorted from Cedar Creek Medical by the same security team he had threatened Hannah within her final week. His medical license was suspended pending investigation into the deletion attempt, into the destruction of medical records, into the retaliation against a healthcare worker for providing emergency treatment. The board convened. The decision was unanimous. His employment was terminated. His career, constructed over 37 years of methodical climbing and careful alliances, collapsed in the span of 48 hours. Within 1 week, the news reached the broader medical community in Raleigh. Dr. Robert Ashford, former department head, was now teaching CPR and basic life support certification at Raleigh Community College for $15 an hour, his name already becoming something whispered in hospital break rooms as a cautionary tale. The decorations on his wall, which had once impressed residents, meant nothing now. The board connections that had felt like armor turned to ash. His brother-in-law refused his calls. Hannah did not witness any of this directly. She was already gone. On the morning of day 6, she arrived at Raleigh-Durham International Airport carrying a single tactical pack on her shoulder. Inside was body armor from 2008, a Garmin Fortrek 601 GPS unit she had maintained through 12 years of civilian life, and the folded flag from her teammate's funeral service, preserved and protected in its rigid case. She walked across the tarmac toward the CR-17 Globemaster with the wind cutting across the runway hard enough to move her hair, hard enough to test her balance, and she did not falter. Torres, recovered enough to travel, stood in his wheelchair at the edge of the tarmac in his dress uniform. He saw her. He saluted. His hands shook but his back remained straight. Hannah returned the salute without slowing her pace, no words needed, no explanation required. 12 years collapsed into a single gesture. The recognition was complete. The cargo door of the aircraft stood open like a mouth. The wind howled through the fuselage. Hannah climbed the ramp with her pack secure and her mind already forward, already moving toward the mission brief and the forward operating base in Cunha Province where her medical expertise and her combat background would be used for the purpose they had always been designed for. She stood at the threshold of the open door and looked back once at Raleigh-Durham, at the hospital in the distance, at the city where she had tried to be someone she was not. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. The cargo door closed. The hydraulics hissed and sealed. And Gunnery Sergeant Hannah Clarke disappeared into the mission she was always meant for. In Cedar Creek Medical's ICU, they hung a photograph on the wall. It was her in dress uniform, taken 8 years earlier at a Marine Corps function, her decorations visible and unmistakable. Beneath it, someone had placed a plaque reading her rank and awards. A new resident, on her first shift, asked the senior nurse who the woman in the photo was. The senior nurse smiled, the same nurse who had watched Hannah perform the needle decompression, who had seen the truth of who she was before the military arrived. "That's Gunnery Sergeant Hannah Clarke," the nurse said. "She taught me that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. And that the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you watched someone you loved be underestimated by someone with power, and that person was vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you'd been Hannah? Would you have boarded that helicopter, or would the peace of civilian life have been too precious to surrender? Share this story with someone who needs to remember that hidden strength often wears scrubs.